Hello, welcome everybody. I am Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia program here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute, as I'm sure many of you know, but some of you perhaps do not, is a rather new institute in Washington, D.C., 5 years old now, which advocates for restraint and in US foreign and security policy opposes interventionism, especially military interventionism and adventurism, and argues for, when possible, it isn't always, peace and cooperation in international affairs. Before introducing today's panel, I just wanted to flag a webinar in a week's time, but at 10 a.m. EST, on Trumponomics and their implications for America's place in the world. Today, by the way, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the, you see the button at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass on as many of them as I can in the time to the members of the panel. So today, it's a great pleasure to introduce a highly distinguished panel on something rather important that happened this week, as you may have heard, which is the German federal elections, leading to the, well, forthcoming creation of a new German coalition government, and the implications of this for Germany, for Europe, and for German and European relations with the United States and US policy. To discuss this, there is Wolfgang Streeck. He is Director Emeritus of the Max Planck Institute, a member of the British Academy and of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, and one of the leading thinkers and writers, not just in Europe, but in the world today, on contemporary political economics and especially the consequences of globalism. His books include Critical Encounters, Capitalism, Democracy, Ideas, and his most recent book is Taking Back Control, States and State Systems After Globalism, which came out in November. Molly O'Neill is a long-standing, retired now, member of the US Foreign Service and a non-resident fellow here at the Quincy Institute and an expert in US foreign policy and the affairs of Europe. And Thomas Fasbender is a German journalist who was for many years, partly overlapping with me, a German correspondent in Moscow. He is now the chief of geopolitics at the Berliner Zeitung. He is the author of several books, including a biography of Vladimir Putin, and his latest book, so far only in German, unfortunately, The Eurasia Complex, Why and How the Future Slipped Away from the West, was published this month. Congratulations, Thomas. So, well, to begin, on the whole, most of the election results conformed pretty closely to the opinion polls, with as they had been coming out in the previous weeks. There was one major exception, which surprised people, which was how well the left party, Die Linke, did. And so I'd like to begin by asking you, Wolfgang, how do you see the reasons for this? Why did they do so well compared to expectations? And what do you think this says about attitudes, especially among German youth, because they got a very, very high youth vote, and the future of German politics? I think you may be muted still. You are muted, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Now, voting of young people, and that was basically a young people vote, is highly unpredictable because you do not have a tradition for the individual to vote for a particular party. So it's very volatile. Just if you look 3.5 years ago, at the last federal election, then the marvel for the commentators was that about 25% of the young voters voted for the Greens and 25% voted for of all parties for the Liberals, for the FDP. Yeah. Now Liberals and FDP are completely out of range for young voters. They've just abandoned them. This new generation of young voters votes for two different outsider parties. One is Die Linke, 25% among voters between 18 and 24 vote for the Linkspartei, but at the same time, 21% of the same group vote for AfD. Yeah, it's against somewhat symmetrical to the Green FDP polarization that we observed last time. Now, if you look at this age cohort now, you have to look at the 25 to 34 years group. That group, the AfD is stronger than it was in the 18 to 24 year, namely 23%. Whereas left voters were almost sort of disappeared, or very, very, very much cut down, like 15%. So what I want to say is, do not attribute too much importance to this event. It is not like earlier election studies in the United States showed that that when you vote for the first time, a habit is fixed that this generation will carry through the end of their lives. So that if in the 1930s you voted for Roosevelt, you would vote for the Democrats until you die in the 1980s. Yeah, that is no longer the case. There's too much volatility in the thing. So I would, as far as the vote goes, I would not attribute too much importance to this. What I, however, think is it does make a difference is that they now have a parliamentary group of about 10% of the seats in parliament, which gives them a blocking vote on all decisions that require a 2/3 majority. And like always, if you move on from the raw material of votes to the consequences for the practical everyday life in parliament, and then you look at this for a multi-party system like in Germany, you see that even a very narrow margin among the electorate can have important political consequences at the level of practical politics. In this case, we will probably talk about this also, is the 17,000 votes that were missing for BSW to also join the parliament, which would have meant that you would have needed a 3-party coalition rather than a 2-party coalition to form a government, which would be an entire different game to what we are seeing now.
Yeah. Thomas, it's widely been seen as a heavily anti-establishment vote, especially among the youth. Is this something that you agree with? And do you see this continuing in German politics? And of course, when it comes to AfD, but also perhaps Die Linke, is Germany following in the path of France, that the centre is irreversibly, if gradually, shrinking? And of course, from the point of view of AfD, how long do you think the Brandmauer, the firewall against them, can be maintained?
Well, to start with, the one comforting result for me was the fact that voters allowed Germany her governability for the next coming years. I wouldn't say not necessarily the next 4 years, but at least the coming years, maybe 1, maybe 2, by a 2-party coalition. This is related to the fact that the BSW actually, as you said, marginally was voted out of parliament. They try to get into parliament, but I don't think that their chances, their legal chances are really very high. So we have, on the one side, we have a governability, thank God, it needs to be said. On the other side, we have a clear polarization across the political spectrum, across the age cohorts. It expresses itself less or differently in different age cohorts, but what we have is, roughly speaking, we have 20% very establishment critical people on the right, and we have about 20%, let's say, slightly less government critic people on the left, but definitely anti-right people on the left. So you have 20% anti-left people on the right, and you have 20% anti-right people on the left, which was accelerated by the Kampf gegen Rechts, the fight against the right demonstrations over the previous weeks, the 3 or 4 weeks immediately prior to elections, which made it clear that we have a part of the population, 20%, who will stick to their right-wing views, and we have a part of the population, 20%, about 20%, which, and I take left and Greens all together, which definitely will defend left-wing positions. In between, 60%, somewhere about 60%, those parties who call themselves Democrats. It is larger, in fact, because the Green Party can be legitimately be called democratic, absolutely, but it still represents, it's at the same time a leftist and a democratic party here, if we assume that the AfD is not 100% a democratic party, just given this widely distributed judgment about the party. I would not necessarily share it, but we have this polarization, and now the big task ahead is for the governing parties, the governing coalition, to recreate a sort of consensus, to revitalize a consensus around the center, somewhere the center left, the center right, but somewhere around the census on which the country can build her political future. Because, as you said, the danger is that if now the in future governing coalition will not manage to satisfy or to alleviate the dissatisfaction, to appease the unrest among parts of the population with respect to migration, with respect to integration of foreigners, with respect to security, then we may face a very dangerous for our democracy future ahead.
Molly, what do you think are the implications of this for Germany's external policy and relations with the United States? And how do you think these election results and this new coalition will be viewed by the Trump administration?
Well, all I can say is that today Trump has announced 25% tariffs on EU goods, and so I think that's not a good indication that a rapprochement is in the prospect. I agree with everything that's been said already about the outcome. I'd like to just throw a couple of other ideas in. I agree that I think the American establishment on foreign affairs is definitely aware, and you saw that Constanze Stelzenmüller article in the Financial Times, I guess, saying that, making clear, and I think this is shared across the board among people who have been strongly transatlanticist in the States, is that this is a tremendous importance that this coalition actually is formed, and that it restores some kind of reverses the decline of all of these mainstream parties, because, I think this is like a near-death experience for the SPD. I mean, as we've all seen, it's the lowest vote for them since 1887. And if you look at the potential in the future for such a coalition to be formed, so-called grand coalition, the only way it was formed this time is because of the fluke of BSW falling below the 5% threshold. So I'm afraid you may be looking into the nearest future at something that looks more like Austrian politics, where there's really two big parties, both of which are on the right. One really strongly on the right, maybe analogous to AfD, and the other one also on the right. And so if that happens, really, that just shows, I think, if that's a something that could happen or might has some kind of a serious probability of happening, I think it really does revolutionize the whole transatlantic relationship. Just as, for example, when or if Le Pen's party comes to she wins the presidency. Both of these things are really important and consequential for the United States as well. But currently, I think the mindset of the Trump administration is very much more on the notion that it's possibly a salutary shock if the Europeans will decide to shoulder responsibility for their own defense, at least their conventional defense. And so that does seem to be an impact which is visible. But what and palpable with Merritt's his remarks about finding independence from the United States, I thought that was really a watershed that any CDU, CSU politician would have said that. And I understand why he said it. But what I'm afraid of is that this kind of self assertion of the European Union or Europe as a whole, European NATO membership, let's say, or the European Union or both, this kind of assertion is very much dogged by these problems of collective action. It's not clear who is the leader. I mean, Macron would like to set the agenda. Now, I believe Merz will try to set the agenda, and he'll try to also restore that tandem with France. And maybe also work closely with the Commission, although I'd like the German opinion of both of you experts about whether the Merz-von der Leyen tandem is really very likely. I gather there's a lot of differences among them. And coming back to the migration issue, if I had to explain the BSW's falling short relative to this rise of Die Linke, which is no one really, it was in the polls, by the way, it was in all the latest polls that they were going to cross the threshold. The reason, though, for their bounce, I would impute this to their stance they took on when Merz made that resolution about migration back in January. Die Linke took a principled stand of a nie wieder, and they were out on all of the demonstrations. Sarah Wagenknecht had a nuanced and to some extent, I think it turned out to be not an effective stance that she took, was that BSW, we need to understand the public is very concerned about this migration issue, and we need to find some kind of a accommodation for that public opinion. It turned out that was a smarter stance. That wasn't a smart stance. Die Linke tactically was, I don't know if it was tactically or because their principles are their principles, but they stood much more unambiguously for shutting out the AfD and for keeping Germany open, no fortress, no discrimination. And among young people, I believe that is something that they care about, or at least those that went to Die Linke. So.
Thank you. Yes, but Wolfgang, I mean, the problem there is, of course, I mean, if migration is becoming one of the critical issues, and if in fact left and right are totally divided on this subject, I mean, how in the long run can Germany be governed? I mean, how can you have any sort of coherent national policy?
You won't have it. That's the answer. And let me say that if you go back to the BSW fatality in this election, they tried, and I can testify to that, they tried to define a position that would combine openness to immigration with limitations to immigration. Understanding that there are a lot of people in the German society who are not afraid of the Turkish grocer. The Turkish grocer is a fantastic enrichment for our society, but they are afraid of the idea of unlimited immigration. now that raises a very complicated problem of constitutional rights, of international agreements, and all of this, of refoulement at the border, all of this. The BSW didn't have enough time to discuss this because it's a very young party. It had to fight an election that was half a year earlier than the original election. They had to build up 16 federal state organizations. So then they got into a trap. And the trap was that, as Molly mentioned, the discussion on immigration shortly before the election was one where the majority, which have no agreement among themselves as to what to do, was able to pretend that they were together fighting the new Nazi, the new Nazism, the new 1933, sort of in the form of the AfD, and that increased. That had a very interesting consequence. This year, election turnout was 7 percentage points above the 2021 election, which is, as you know, electoral sociology, which is quite an amount. We have an 84 or 83% election turnout. And the young people that came in, sort of what they heard in the news and everywhere was that there are people, bad people, who want to send their pals down to Turkey or Afghanistan, with whom they had perfectly excellent relations, and then they wanted to defend them. Very sort of morally, very applaudable, but electorally a sort of disaster for a party that knows that without some sort of accommodation between the desire for a limitation on immigration on the one hand, and the necessary openness of that society on the other hand, that without such a thing, this issue is ungovernable. Mm-hmm. And if you remember what German parties of the center did in the past, was they sort of rhetorically delegated that issue to the European Union, knowing that the European Union is absolutely unable to deal with it. Because in the European Union regime of Dublin, the idea is that countries where these immigrants come in for the first time are responsible for them, and then they get distributed, although they all want to go to Germany. So the idea is that Italy, France, Greece, or whoever sort of do the job for the Germans, while the Germans are celebrating themselves to have open borders and be a society without borders. That could never work, and it never worked. So I put this on the list of issues of which I expect that this new government, governability, Thomas mentioned that this new government will be unable to solve a series of extremely tricky problems that, if I may say that and then finish this longish lecture, most of these problems have accumulated over decades. In the wonderful years of Angela Merkel, when we basically sort of consumed the heritage of the earlier sort of prosperous West German society, and then we slowly ate away at it and let it decay, and then now we come to an election where, at a record low, we see the confidence of the electorate in the political parties, the state, and the official media. You never had in the voting, in the polls, a lower score in the sense of who do I trust? Who do I trust? They don't trust them anymore. On this capital run a government. I congratulate them for the job.
Well, I mean, on that score, Thomas, is this a grand coalition, or is this a permanent coalition? Words, if the determination still is to keep AfD out, and if it is impossible to create a left-wing coalition with a majority, does that mean that, in fact, Thomas, that forever, until they can't do it anymore, it will be a coalition between the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens if the CDU and SPD can't get a majority together? What do you think?
Well, Anatol, there's nothing forever, never in life. That's the good thing. Look to Austria today. An interesting aspect. They formed a three-party coalition with a strong emphasis on a harsh migration policy. They formed this coalition with two purposes. First of all, to keep the FPÖ, the Austrian AfD, to put it simply, out of government, and the second to pacify their voters, to make sure that the non-populist parties show that they can deal with migration and integration, whatever it takes. It's a very interesting template, actually, that will certainly be read very tentatively by the Social Democrats and the CDU in Germany when starting their coalition negotiations. We'll have to see how it works out. The test of times will be, can the established parties manage the issues of migration, of integration, of economical recovery, justice, etc. And that is, it's up to a test. I wouldn't say lost, but we spent 16 years under Angela Merkel by keeping up the hope that all will be fine. Without migration, with migration, we keep open borders, we keep our ideals high. And the way it worked out. Yeah? We're having a heap of problems. Populists on the left and on the right are rising. And let me add one aspect on the BSW. The problem one of the reasons for the BSW was they ran high on the peace ticket, because against the backdrop of NATO, Western governments supporting not a full out, but basically an open-end support of the Ukrainian defense war, of the Ukrainian military target to recover their occupied lands, etc. That motivated part of their followership, part of the electorate, to give them high marks. Then came Trump, and since Trump election, we have among the German electorate, a large part of the German electorate, a sort of firm conviction that, well, now Trump will manage peace. Yeah. So the eternal war danger is by far not seen as seriously, as dangerously than it used to be 5 months ago. So before 4 months ago, 3 months ago, before the November elections, that contributed for a good part to the failure of the BSW. And then the second problem here is not only the German government, all the European governments, they find themselves now between a rock and a hard place, because all migration issues are considered national issues. Honestly, nobody in Germany really gives a long thought to what the Spaniards and the Portuguese and even the French have to deal with when it comes about migration. The thing is, how do we manage our borders, our German borders? And the Austrians think alike, and the Hungarians think alike, and everybody. On the other hand, everybody understands that for a European future in the world, in a multipolar world, there is no national way. Yeah, Germany, Austria, Spain, as nations, as 100 years ago, it's absolutely not even a point to discuss. It's useless. So governments will be torn. And I don't see a way out here. Governments will be torn more and more between two completely different approaches as claimed by their electorate. Deal with migration on a national level, deal with the status of Europe and the power of Europe and its influence on a European level. And I must say, I do not see a way out here.
No. No, indeed. I mean, Molly, if you were to take European leaders seriously, possibly in some cases a mistake, if you were to listen to some of what Friedrich Merz has been saying about the Ukraine war and European independence, one might think that there would be an attempt by this coalition and by other European leaders actually to try to wreck the Trump-led peace process in Ukraine. And even although they say this and then immediately backtrack on it, Starmer in Washington today, I mean, even try to go on supporting Ukraine without the US. How serious do you think is the German and European split with Washington or with this administration in Washington over Ukraine?
Well, I think this issue of Europe as an actor, an autonomous actor in a multipolar order, is something that is serious. In other words, that I think that's one of the two responses to Trump's gambit on, opening those negotiations with Russia, is to doubt the American commitment to Article 5 and therefore to look at possibilities of building the capabilities, defense capabilities of Europe. But I don't agree that it will be done at a European level. I would like to see that, but I don't see neither Germany nor France or anybody else. Certainly Britain is not even in the EU, and they're an important player. So I do see it requiring some collective action and agreement, accord to be reached among Europeans, and that is why member states, not the Commission or not the Council. So that's why Macron held his meetings just immediately after the talks had happened in Riyadh. And then Macron and now Starmer are trying to persuade Trump to leave them at least some space to be involved in a peace initiative and to protect some sort of core requirement for the sovereignty of Ukraine. So I think that's the gambit that we're going to see the Europeans individually take. But how there's a range of opinion in Europe, which is, I don't really see how they coalesce around a plan that would actually have potential to have weight with the Americans. And I also see the Trump administration to some extent, I mean, it seems obvious to me, the Trump administration would like to relegate the EU to the margins of any discussion. And you saw, for example, that Secretary of State Rubio canceled a meeting that he had agreed to with Kai Kallas, who's coming to the States, I think, in the next days. So and it's the only reference I ever hear the Trump administration make to European Union is on the trade front, and there it's very hostile. I don't know if they've even come to understand that there has been a political project of Europe and that is real. Or maybe they do understand it, but they've decided that the United States' advantage is better served by these bilateral arrangements. So, I agree that this whole Ukraine thing is the overtures made by the United States have really produced a world changing kind of systemic kind of challenge for the Europeans. So I don't know, and I'm doubtful that there's going to be a meaningful role for Europe in sort of trying to at least decelerate or have some kind of influence upon the process. I think that's what they're trying to do. I don't really think they could imagine that they're going to be able to thwart the entire plan that Trump has. On the other hand, they may be relying on President Trump to be not very constant in keeping up his objectives. He does seem to be, for example, I don't think anybody was expecting that there would be the signature of this agreement by Zelensky on this mining of strategic minerals. I don't know if that really adds up to anything, but someone in Europe may be thinking, at least some of the players in Europe may be thinking, that this produces more leverage on Trump to stay in the conflict. So have I answered any of your questions?
Well, insofar as one can, of course.
Oh, I wanted to talk about the debt.
Yeah, I think I fully agree with Molly on her assessment of the future of the European Union in this game. Right now, being sort of shocked by what happened in Washington, the traditional governments or the governments in Europe, or the mainstream of European international politics, they are really trying to convince themselves and their citizens that this requires a sort of pseudo-NATO response to Russia by rearmament all over the place, and then sort of integration of Europe under a joint command. I mean, everyone who thinks about this twice knows that a joint command of France and Germany over a European army is just a total no-go. This is absolutely impossible. Yeah, we know this, but then we are now hearing that we have to arm heavily in order to push back an attack that our defense minister in Germany schedules for 5 years from now. How does he know this? and how does he know this? And what is even worse, if you look at the statistics from the CIPRI in Stockholm, then the major European nations right now, even after 3 years of war and after a sort of spectacular increase in the Russian war economy, we are now spending 4.5 times as much as Russia on defense, on so-called defense. Now we are going to double this. And according to our defense minister, it's going to be 8 times as much as Russia, maybe 7 times in 5 years. How in the world can it be realistic that Putin or whoever follows him would decide sort of to march into Berlin for the second time since 1945 to do whatever he wants to do there? Nobody knows. Doing trade with Germany is absolutely better for Russia than conquering it. Then that seems to be completely clear. But it shows you how inept the European strategic geopolitical discourse is when it comes to coping with this new situation. Why not think about a new organization for the European state system that allows the major nation to sort of work in a Eurasian context, work out relations with Russia and the states around Russia in a sort of new OECE arrangement where you have all sorts of sort of established confidence building measures, mutual supervision, all of these things as an alternative both to dependence on the United States and to the sort of completely mad idea that the European Union could become a second United States, sort of armed to the teeth and threatening Russia of all places, whose trade they absolutely need in order to remain prosperous nation. I just think that the situation, and then let me say, if you see someone like Macron, who has basically played all his cards domestically and lost every game, now he thinks that by calling people to the Elysee, he can sort of present to the rest of the world the big new European unifier after Napoleon. And what you see is he goes to Washington yesterday, and I saw this press conference and this meeting that they had as sort of Trump playing a very cruel game with this.
Yeah.
Very cruel and humiliating him in front of the press by saying all these stupid things, and Macron had to jump up and pretend that he believed and that he was grateful for.
Yeah.
Yes?
But it's just the same with Starmer. Starmer's played all his cards already, basically, and he hasn't even been in power for a year yet. And I think he's trying to distract attention also by pretending to play this great role on the world stage. I mean, we look forward to what Trump will do to him today in Washington. But I don't suppose it will be very nice. I mean, it's funny because, of course, we're all of us old enough. Oh dear, we're all so old. Most people aren't. But to remember Gorbachev and his vision of a common European home and the Gorbimania with which this was received. So, I mean, Thomas, does anyone remember Gorbachev in Germany now? Does anyone, I mean, beyond this panel, retain this sort of vision for Europe and Germany in Europe?
I'd rather say hardly, because there are quite a few people who even accuse themselves of having fallen into the trap of the Gorbimania in those days, having believed that Russians can be trustful and not deceiving, and now pretending to have learned the truth again. The big danger is we're all falling, not those here in this group, but we in Germany at least, and most people, most of my colleagues, politicians as well, they fall into the trap of this old saying of the generals who always plan the next war based on the lectures of the previous ones. So the previous wars, you can take a mix of the war before 1945 plus the Cold War, and there you have there's only one antagonist from a Western European point of view, which is Soviet Union / Russia, and that's why we try to always put Putin in the mold of an old Soviet politician who only wants to recreate the Soviet Union. So sometimes I get the impression that my contemporaries in my profession, they're glad about the return of the good old times, the good old days when you knew who your enemy was. And these people are very sure who their enemy is. They will buy thousands of tanks probably to defend against a future invasion. And I'm always mocking. Yeah, I ask, well, are you sure the Russians will, as the last time, stop at the Elbe? Will it not be the Rhine? Will it not be the Channel? Maybe they want to conquer the British Islands. And it's really necessary to joke about this. It's necessary to be sarcastic because otherwise you don't have a chance to break up. Without sarcasm, you don't have a chance to break up these prejudices about the necessarily evil Russia, yeah, which has shown its evil since before Tsar Peter the Great, of course. As long as we don't get out of it, as long as we see Western Europe in this traditional antagonism towards despotic Russia, we will not manage anything. And at the same time, and now it becomes interesting, at the same time, Trump has understood, as I understand, I was at the CCAP conference in Washington last week, as I understand the whole project is this is no American isolationism. This goes far beyond. This goes into a revitalization of a European, Judeo-Christianic, European-based civilization. Yeah, this has sounds much more like Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And so what J.D. Vance says, what Trump says, what Elon Musk says, and others. And I interpret the policies of the new U.S. administration in large as reaching out to realign Russia, because Russia is sort of part of our civilization, to realign Russia with this large Western position. And now the poor Europeans, with their petty principles of rule-based world order, they get in between and become a nuisance.
Which they learned from America, of course.
Which they learned from America, but they become a nuisance, sort of. And they're far from understanding that they have become a nuisance, but they are helpless in their own position. So I'm, of course, exaggerating a bit, but I see the poor Europeans getting into a poorer and poorer position, and the Trump logic just winning the table.
Yes, I mean, one thing that does, I must say, deeply irritate me about some of the Europeans, because they always, like to pride themselves on this, that, oh, we have a sense of history, is when you get people like Pierre Servan in France talking about Russia as our ancient enemy. Of course, I imagine what he was thinking about was the Battle of Leipzig. The only problem was the Russians were indeed on the opposite side from France, but then, of course, so were the Prussians and the Austrians and the British and the Swedes. Um, although, from his point of view, it must be said that at least the Saxons were on the right side at the Battle of Leipzig. No, I mean, it's enough to really. Oh, Lord. Yes. Where was I? But Molly, I mean, from that point of view, I sometimes get the impression, because what, Vance's remarks at Munich, which caused this, dreadful flurry and was universally portrayed as, Vance against Europe. But actually what he was doing was quite different. He was, I think really setting himself up, not so much the Trump administration, as the leader precisely of a conservative international. This he, of course, is a convert to Catholicism, and like many converts, he's literally become more Catholic than the Pope, if you look at their
Oh,
recent.
less Catholic.
um, and I mean, he, I think, exactly sees this new vision, indeed, perhaps including Russia, of America and Europe, but coming together along completely new ideological lines. Do you think this has? Do you think this is going to play an important part in the future of US conservative thinking?
Well, certainly that outlook is shared by both Vance, and I think is even more exaggerated in the case of Steve Bannon, who I know was also at the CPAC conference. So yes, I think these people, it is very much coming out of that Huntington book, that there's a natural affinity and a civilizational divide between the Christian, well, you might say Judeo-Christian world and and
I didn't say it. He did.
yeah, exactly. And he did say it, and even Bannon does use that term, even though, to be honest, I wonder. Anyway, yeah. So what I think is the case, is, I mean, it's pretty obvious that the AfD, for example, like all of these populist right parties, is one of the features of their program is rapprochement with Russia. And it wasn't much attention wasn't paid to it in this particular election, or at least I didn't get that sense. The only party that tried to run on that really was BSW, which is, for reasons Thomas said, didn't turn out to be that salient of an issue because of Trump's overtures to Russia. So, but you have it in Romania, of course. You have it in Austria, of course, and you have it even in Britain with the Farage party. There are, all of these are in the same vein. So it is a sort of a conservative, religious sort of framework, isn't it, or international? Like certainly Hungary has Orban shares the same the same position. So because of the slow, the seeming momentum of these populist right parties in Europe and their that shared value system that is, that makes them tend to admire Russia, for example. I do think that this, I mean, the only other type of conservatism that we have, which is our traditional one in America, is based upon small government and liberties, which of course Vance did nod to that. But interestingly enough, he used that to bludgeon Europeans. So that was kind of interesting. But anyway, yes, I think it does seem to be the leading trend in conservatism in the United States now. And because Vance is young and he's able, and we'll have to see, but there is a possibility that he will be continuing on in the same vein in the next election.
Mm. some questions from the floor. The first of which I'll answer myself, I think, which is given the disastrous results of the previous Grand Coalition for the SPD, why are they so keen to join the CDU again? Are they masochists? Well, I think the answer to that, which we would all give, is that unless the CDU is going to form a coalition with AfD, Germany simply cannot be governed otherwise. That's the only possible government that can be. Another question for Thomas or Wolfgang, but I think really for all of us everywhere, who may once upon a time have belonged to the liberal consensus. But is there any sense in the German establishment, I mean the wider establishment, including the intellectual and cultural establishment, that they have made mistakes, that they have made serious mistakes over the past generation or so? Or in fact, is the overwhelming mood simply to double down on the
I would say, Wolfgang, you know the German establishment much better than I do.
Yeah, and I think they don't think like that. That would require a sense of historical thinking. I think that was last present in the German government under Helmut Kohl, who used to think about the longer term history of Germany since the war and where it might be going. Now, we have sort of artists in short-term pseudo-solution. Yeah, and they are sort of advised by spin doctors of all sort who have no idea of the underlying structural fundamental problems. And if they had such ideas, they would be silent about them because it would discourage their masters. Their masters are masters of hiding the very fundamental problems that all these societies. One thing in the election campaign that was completely interesting was that Germany was discussed in terms of Germany, if it was discussed at all. But that, for example, the fiscal crisis of the state was not just a German problem. It's a problem of Italy. It's one of Sweden, even
Britain,
France, Britain. Yeah, everywhere. And rather than thinking that there might be some sort of common dynamic underlying this, that might have to do with globalization, the capacity of states to tax their societies, yeah, with the growing demands in these societies for repair work with respect to the damages left by advanced capitalism, including the energy and the environmental transformation, yeah, that this was a general problem that is not available for short-term solutions. In this whole election campaign, for example, the fact that our government and the governments of these other societies have been able to survive by pretending that they did not have to regularly maintain and repair, for example, the physical and social infrastructure, the school system. Germany is declining in international, in the PISA rating, from rating to rating. Nobody feels responsible to address the underlying problems, which very often are, or to a large extent, are financial problems. The same thing applies to what we now see, the crumbling of the bridges, of the roads. I live on the River Rhine, and you hear that all these bridges that are absolutely essential for the German economy will, in the incoming years, have to be replaced. If you imagine that, yeah, it's unbelievable. The railway system in Germany, which used to be a miracle of the world, now it's Switzerland, and in Germany you can never know when you will arrive once you board a train. And if you estimates of what all of this costs in the next 10 years, including sort of the entire environmental transformation, and then you add on this what our defense minister tells us, that where we now are spending 40 billion on defense, in a few years, before the Russians come, we will have to spend 100 billion every year.
Mm.
Where the hell is that money coming from? And then they are telling us, well, then we change the debt brake, or we allow the European Union to borrow on its own account, and we will be silent on who is going to cover that account once one state or another sort of defaults because they are no longer solvent. Yeah? This sort of complete irresponsibility. That's my answer, Anna, to what you're asking. You're asking too much of them. That's why, yeah, too much of what they can do. That's why I am convinced, as I think Thomas was when he said that it is not at all clear whether this government will be in office for 4 years. The difference between the CDU and the SPD is enormous in so many respects. And maybe I can just say something on the numbers. It is not so that Merz has won the election. Merz has, sort of after the complete disaster of the Christian Democrats with a completely inept candidate 4 years ago.
Yeah.
In the last year, 1 year ago, in the polls, he was at 37%. He slowly declined as people observed his performance and his wavering between a sort of a centrist policy and a demagogic rhetoric, trying to include the AfD, thereby making it stronger. Yeah, all of these things, people then suddenly, he's down to 28 or whatever. That's an enormous loss. And the Social Democratic Party is basically the same. They had the chancellor in government. They were the dominant force in the government that had to resign. And Scholz is gone. Scholz is gone. Now someone who had never has had an office in government, young man, taking over the party and trying to negotiate something with Merz, who is wounded. So, for example, he tried to untie the debt brake, and then overnight was told by the Christian Socialist Party from Christian Social Party from Bavaria that they would not want to do this. Next time he appears in front of the press and says, "We never thought about it." Yeah, and this is really scary. It is scary, and in 3 years, as was said, in 3 years, the AfD could be the biggest party in parliament, and then the ungovernability of the society will become so bad that people will lose confidence in the democratic system. And that is what I personally fear.
Well, I mean, this is becoming a cliche. But you mentioned the railways. Anyone who has traveled recently on Chinese railways, at least, is liable to prefer, at least from that point of view, the Chinese system. It's very striking. But I think, one common thing that you do therefore see, all over the place, is more and more voters saying we must concentrate on reform at home. We must concentrate on, trying to restore things at home. And that, of course, will be a huge challenge in the end for this expansionist idea of Europe and of Germany and Britain and so forth on the world stage. I don't see how that can be sustained. In democracies with the electorate. The other thing, of course, one sees so much in every European country, and in America too, becoming increasingly explicit, is this open contempt for the mass of the population in the security elites. Oh, they're illiterate. Somebody actually said that on CNN the other day. The mass of the American population is illiterate. They don't understand international affairs, therefore we should basically ignore them and except, of course, that in the end they have to pay the taxes, which go to fund all this. Well, we haven't been very cheerful. Oh, just one final point. Sorry, from my own experience, but when I was briefly a British journalist in Germany, I think one critical thing, I was so struck by the difference between the people who had gone through the war, even if only as children, like Cole, but who remembered it and had been brought up by their parents to remember it, and the new generation which does not. It was quite. I mean, that was possibly for me the biggest divide in the German population. And of course the older generation is, well, getting old, right? But I mean, the attitude of somebody like Annalena Baerbock to war would have appalled somebody like Helmut Schmidt, who was no softy, God knows, but he would have regarded this as irresponsible, teenage irresponsibility to the absolutely last degree. Anyway, sorry, that's my own rather bitter reflections. We are out of time. We could go on talking for a very, very long time, and I'm sorry to all the audience whose questions I didn't have time to get to. But thank you all so much. This was a fascinating, if not encouraging, discussion, and I look forward to further discussions in future. So thank you very much indeed.